The Dakota wind cut like a cavalry saber across the prairie. It was January 11th, 1884, just past 3 p.m., and the temperature had plummeted a staggering 40 degrees in less than 20 minutes. The world outside the single, thick-paned window was a churning vortex of white chaos, a horizontal blizzard that erased the horizon and screamed with the fury of a dying god. But inside the hillside, Silas Garrett felt only a whisper of the cold. The air in his home was a steady 58 degrees, warmed by a small cast-iron stove that consumed wood with miserly efficiency. His wife, Ada, calmly stitched a patch onto a pair of trousers by the light of a kerosene lamp. In the adjoining stable, carved from the same earth, their chestnut mare, Copper, crunched contentedly on her oats, shielded from a wind that could freeze a steer solid in under an hour. Silas placed another small log in the stove. The earth around them, a dozen feet thick on all sides, held the day's warmth like a stone clutched in a fist, impervious to the apocalyptic force raging just beyond their door. 6 months earlier, in July of 1883, the world had been a different kind of cruel. The heat baked the cracked earth of what used to be Silas Garrett's farm. Now it belonged to the Providence Territorial Bank. Marcus Webb, the bank's owner and the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, had been regretful in that oily way of men who hold all the cards. A blight, 2 dry seasons. It was unfortunate, but business was business. The bank seized the 320 acres of prime bottomland, the farmhouse Silas's father had built, the barn, the fences. They couldn't, however, seize the 40 acres of worthless hillside Silas had bought a decade prior for $5. It was a patch of scruffy prairie that tilted sharply upward into a south-facing bluff, considered useless for farming or grazing. It was there, with Ada at his side and Copper pulling a stone boat, that Silas stood before Mayor Hutchkins. The mayor wiped sweat from his brow, squinting at the raw gash Silas had begun digging into the hill. "What in God's name are you doing, Silas?" "Building a home, Mayor." Hutchkins laughed, a short, sharp bark. "In the ground? People will think you've lost your mind. We're civilized folk here. We build proper houses with frames and clapboard." Silas jammed his shovel into the hard-packed soil. "This will be a proper house. Warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, and stronger than any wooden box you could build on the prairie." Marcus Webb rode up then, his fine horse a stark contrast to Silas's sweat-stained work clothes. He surveyed the scene with an amused smirk. Webb's new house, a 2-story monstrosity with imported glass and a wide veranda, was nearing completion on the edge of town. It was the biggest house in the territory. "Heard you were digging for gold, Garrett," Webb called out. "Found anything besides dirt?" "Just building a place to live, Mr. Webb." Webb chuckled, a sound like coins rubbing together. "A badger hole, is it? Well, I suppose it suits a man who's lost everything. Let me know if you need to borrow a cup of dirt." He tipped his hat to the mayor and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and derision in his wake. Silas ignored them and went back to work. He didn't need to explain his vision to men who couldn't see past the surface of things. His knowledge wasn't born of books or fancy schooling, but of hard-won experience. For 8 years, he'd worked as a surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad, mapping lines through the treacherous passes of the Rocky Mountains. He'd spent winters in survey camps where the difference between life and death was understanding the physics of snow and wind. He'd learned from Pawnee scouts how they positioned their winter lodges to use the Earth's own warmth and the sun's low arc. Later, as a mining engineer in Colorado, he'd learned the structural integrity of tunnels and the profound insulating power of geologic mass. The principles were simple, elegant, and ancient. A home built into a south-facing hill would be shielded from the brutal north wind that scoured the plains all winter. The earth itself acted as a massive thermal battery, absorbing the sun's heat and maintaining a near-constant temperature, around 52 degrees year-round. This phenomenon, known as thermal mass, meant he wouldn't be fighting to heat a structure from freezing. He'd only have to raise the ambient temperature by 10 or 15 degrees for comfort. A conventional house, exposed on all four sides, was in a constant, losing battle with the elements. "This isn't a step backward," he told Ada one evening, as they planned the layout on a piece of scrap paper. "It's a step sideways, into something smarter. The earth provides what open ground doesn't: constant temperature, protection from wind, natural humidity control. The Sinagua people built into cliffs 1,000 years ago, not because they were primitive, but because they understood the advantages." He sketched the ventilation system, a design borrowed from mine shafts. A low intake pipe would draw in fresh, cool air, while a high exhaust flue near the stove would pull out smoke and stale air, creating a constant, gentle circulation. It was a closed, efficient system that worked with nature, not against it. Word of Silas's project spread through the 400 souls of Providence like a prairie fire. It became the town's favorite source of amusement. The name Marcus Webb had coined stuck. It was Garrett's Burrow. Soon, other names followed: the Badger Hole, Silas's Folly, the Dirt Palace. The town's primary builder, Thomas Brennan, a good man who knew lumber and nails better than anyone, stopped by one afternoon. "Silas," he said, his face etched with genuine concern, "this is all wrong. You need a proper foundation, 4-foot frost walls. The ground shifts, the moisture. It'll rot your timbers in a year." Silas paused, leaning on his shovel. "I'm using creosote-treated railroad ties for the main beams, Thomas. They'll outlast us both, and the foundation is the hill itself. As for moisture, I'm digging a French drain around the perimeter and lining the interior walls with a vapor barrier of tar paper." Brennan just shook his head. "It's your funeral, but I've never seen a house built this way, and for good reason. It's not civilized." Even Father O'Brien felt compelled to visit, his black cassock collecting dust as he stood at the edge of the excavation. "My son," he said, his Irish brogue soft with pity, "man was meant to rise above the earth, to build his home toward the heavens, not to burrow back into the soil like a creature of the field. This seems a hiding from God's light." Silas wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. "I'm not hiding, Father. I'm preparing. There's a difference." The mockery became a daily ritual. Men would gather at the general store to debate how long it would take for the roof to collapse. A betting pool was started: $5 on a cave-in before the first snow, 10 on Silas giving up by Christmas. The term "pulling a Garrett" entered the local lexicon, meaning to engage in a pointless, elaborate, and foolish task. Ada faced her own trials. The women of the church sewing circle would fall silent when she entered, their conversations filled with whispers of pity for the poor woman, married to a man who'd clearly been broken by his financial ruin and now chose to live in a hole. But Silas and Ada endured it all with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Their confidence wasn't based on opinion, but on knowledge. The work was grueling, a montage of sweat and earth that stretched through the hot Dakota summer and into the crisp autumn. The excavation was the hardest part. Using shovels, picks, and a scraper pulled by copper, they carved a space 18 feet wide and 24 feet deep into the hillside, the ceiling a solid 9 feet high. It took them 5 weeks of backbreaking labor. Next came the structure. Silas hauled 12 massive pine logs, each 10 inches in diameter, salvaged from a defunct railroad spur line. He treated each one with hot creosote, a stinking, messy job that made them impervious to rot and insects. These formed the main support beams for the roof and the front wall. The front of the dugout was the only part exposed to the elements. Silas built it like a fortress. The base was a 2-foot-thick wall of fieldstone he and Ada gathered from the property, mortared together with a mixture of clay, sand, and lime. Above the stone, the wall was framed with the pine logs and infilled with sod bricks, cut directly from the prairie. Each brick was a dense mat of soil and grass roots, 2 feet long, a foot wide, and 6 inches thick, weighing nearly 50 pounds. They stacked them like massive stones, creating a wall of living earth that was an incredible insulator. He paid a freighter $22 for a small, efficient cast-iron stove and another $15 for 100 feet of stovepipe, which he routed up a carefully constructed chimney flue lined with flat stones. The large south-facing window cost him another $8, a painful expense, but necessary for light and passive solar heat. Inside, they laid a floor of thick, planed boards over a gravel bed for drainage and partitioned off a small bedroom and a pantry. The final crucial step was the stable. Silas excavated an L-shaped extension off the main room, 10 feet by 12 feet, with its own ventilation shaft. A heavy wooden door separated it from their living quarters. This meant Copper, their loyal partner in all this work, would be sheltered within the same protective envelope of earth, her body heat even contributing to the warmth of the home. As the jeers from the town continued, Silas simply focused on the numbers. His home cost a total of $55, not including his own labor. Marcus Webb's new house, he'd heard, cost over $3,000. People watched the construction with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The betting pool on his failure grew to nearly $100. He and Ada were no longer invited to barn raisings or town socials. They were outliers, the strange couple living in the dirt. "Let them watch," Silas told Ada one evening, his voice calm and steady. "They'll understand soon enough. I'd rather waste time than waste lives," he replied to Thomas Brennan, who had come by one last time to plead with him to build a real roof before winter. By late October, the dugout was complete. They moved in their few possessions: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and their kitchen supplies. The first cold snap arrived in November, and the benefits were immediate. While their neighbors were already burning through cords of firewood, Silas found that a small fire in the morning to cook breakfast and another in the evening was enough to keep the dugout comfortably warm. The sun, now low in the southern sky, streamed through the window from dawn till dusk, warming the stone wall and the wooden floor, which radiated heat back into the room long after sunset. They were content, their routine simple and efficient. The town's prediction was universal: give it one winter. They'll come crawling back to civilization. The first week of January, 1884, was unnervingly mild, a false spring that had old-timers shaking their heads. But Silas, with the instincts of a surveyor who had lived by the sky, saw the signs. On January 10th, the barometric pressure on his small aneroid barometer began to drop with an unnatural speed. The birds disappeared, The air grew heavy and still, carrying a strange, metallic taste. That evening, the sky to the northwest took on the color of an old bruise, a sickly yellow-gray. "Ada," he said quietly, "bring in 3 more buckets of water from the well. Check Copper's feed and fill her water trough to the brim." He spent the next morning securing the heavy wooden shutter over the window and banking snow against the stone front of the dugout, adding to the insulation. He double-checked the ventilation flues to ensure they were clear. He tried to warn a few people in town when he went for mail. "A big storm is coming," he told the postmaster. "A bad one. The pressure is dropping faster than I've ever seen." The postmaster just smiled condescendingly. "It's a bit of a squall, Silas. Nothing we haven't seen before. Don't you worry yourself down there in your hole." At 3 p.m. on January 11th, the squall arrived. It did not come as snow, but as a wall of ice-hard wind from the north. The temperature, a balmy 34 degrees at 2:45 p.m., was 0 by 3:15 p.m. and -20 by sunset. The snow didn't fall so much as it attacked, fired horizontally on winds that quickly reached 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm, then to nothing. It was a full-blown, grade A Dakota blizzard, hitting with a speed and ferocity that caught the entire territory unprepared. The world simply ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming white void where the temperature was now 40 degrees below zero. For the town of Providence, it was a catastrophe. The wind, unimpeded by the flat prairie, slammed into the north-facing walls of their civilized homes. It forced its way through every crack, every seam, piling snow in parlors and kitchens. Chimneys, improperly baffled, filled with downdrafts that pushed smoke and ash back into the rooms. Doors were frozen shut or buried under drifts that piled up with terrifying speed. The first casualty was an elderly man who had tried to make it from his house to his woodshed, a distance of 20 yards. He was found 2 days later, frozen solid, just 5 feet from his own back door. Marcus Webb's grand new house became a frozen tomb. The huge, elegant windows, a mark of his wealth, were now his greatest weakness. The single panes of glass offered almost no insulation, and frost, an inch thick, coated them on the inside. His family huddled in a single room, feeding their massive fireplace with precious furniture as the firewood in the house ran out. The wind howled through the eaves, a constant, soul-crushing scream. In Garrett's burrow, there was only a muffled, distant roar, like a faraway waterfall. The stove radiated a gentle, constant heat. The temperature inside never dropped below 55 degrees. They consumed wood at a fraction of the rate of anyone in town. Their water was fresh, their food secure in the pantry, and Copper was safe and warm in her stable, a living, breathing presence just beyond the wall. While Providence froze, the Garretts read books, played checkers, and lived. On the 3rd day of the storm, a frantic pounding came at their door. It took Silas 10 minutes to clear the drift and heave the thick door open. 2 figures literally fell into the dugout, so encrusted with snow and ice they were barely recognizable as human. It was Thomas Brennan, the builder, and his young son. "Silas," Brennan gasped, his face a mask of frozen terror. "My roof!" The weight of the snow. It collapsed. "We have nowhere to go." Silas and Ada helped them out of their frozen coats, sat them by the stove, and gave them hot broth. There was no "I told you so." There was only compassion. They were the first. An hour later, 3 more arrived, neighbors whose chimney had blocked, filling their house with deadly smoke. By nightfall, 12 people were sheltered in the dugout. The next day, Mayor Hutchkins arrived, half dead, his lips blue. His own house was buried to the eaves, his fuel gone. He stumbled in, looked around at the warm, safe space, and the sheer force of Silas's vindication seemed to crush him. He simply sat on the floor and wept. For 5 days, the blizzard raged. 27 people, including 6 children, found refuge in Garrett's burrow. They slept in shifts on the floor, sharing the Garrett stores of potatoes, salted meat, and flour. Silas, with his calm authority born of genuine knowledge, organized them. He rationed the food and water, managed the stove, and kept morale from collapsing. The very people who had mocked him, who had called his home a folly, now looked to him as their savior. When the storm finally broke on the 6th day, the world they emerged into was a desolate, alien landscape of white. The sun shone with blinding intensity on snowdrifts 20 feet high. The town of Providence was shattered. 8 people were dead. Dozens more had severe frostbite. Nearly every building had sustained damage. Marcus Webb's grand house was a wreck, its veranda torn away, its windows shattered. Webb and his family had survived, but only just by burning nearly everything they owned. A week later, as the town began the slow process of digging out and grieving, Marcus Webb walked the half-mile to Silas's dugout. He stood before Silas, his face haggard, his usual arrogance replaced by a profound and humbling exhaustion. "Garrett," he said, his voice raspy, I owe you an apology." Silas simply nodded, waiting. "I called your work a folly. I laughed at you. I thought you were a broken man digging a grave." He gestured back toward the devastated town. "But this folly, it saved 27 lives, while my $3,000 mansion nearly became my family's tomb. I was wrong, dead wrong. You weren't building a home. You were building an ark." Silas looked at the man who had taken his farm, the man who had led the chorus of ridicule. He felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet sorrow for the price of the lesson. "We never wanted to be proven right this way, Mr. Webb. That doesn't matter now. What matters is we start rebuilding, and this time we build smarter." The lesson took hold. That spring, Thomas Brennan came to Silas not with criticism, but with a notebook and a pencil. "You mind if I take some measurements? I want to understand the principles." Silas spent hours with him, explaining the importance of thermal mass, southern exposure, and proper ventilation. By the following winter, the landscape around Providence had changed. 4 new dugout homes were nestled into the hillsides. Brennan had adapted the design for above-ground structures, pioneering a thick-walled sod construction method that became known as the Brennan-Garrett method. Marcus Webb, humbled and changed, financed the construction of a large communal underground shelter near the schoolhouse, a project designed and overseen by Silas. It was officially named the Providence Sanctuary, but everyone called it the Burrow. Silas Garrett lived to be 71 years old, passing peacefully in the home he had carved from the earth. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including the 27 people whose lives he had saved, and their children and their grandchildren. Otta lived there for another 10 years, always keeping a warm stable for Copper's descendants. Years later, the town council placed a bronze plaque next to the sturdy wooden door of the dugout, which still stood, as solid and timeless as the hill it was part of. The dugout itself was preserved as a territorial historic site, a mandatory field trip for school children learning about the brutal realities of frontier life. Experts from back east came to study its design, marveling at its simple, passive efficiency. The plaque read Silas Garrett's Folly, 1883, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom. When civilization's pride froze upon the plain, the humility to work with the earth provided shelter. Preparation is not paranoia, it is the highest form of hope. In memory of the 8 who perished, and in honor of the man whose knowledge saved 27 more. The rock still stands, as rocks do. The prairie wind still howls in winter, as it always will. And the lesson remains, carved not in stone, but in the very soil itself. The wise don't fight nature. They study it, they respect it, and they build with it, understanding that in the eternal contest between human arrogance and natural law always wins.